Welcome to Socho Samjho, another episode. And in this episode, we're going to dive deeper into the world of fact checking with Sophie Timmermann. Sophie, thank you for joining us. For our viewers, Sophie is a journalist. She's an editor in chief with a German based news publication, Corrective. It's basically an investigative platform, if I'm not wrong. She's been working with them since 2021 and heads the fact checking team. Sophie has had a great experience in journalism. She has had worked in debunking disinformation during the coronavirus pandemic. She has worked and covered widely the rise of alternative far right in the UK or the alternative media in the UK. And she has also investigated airstrikes by the US-led coalition in Syria when Bashar al-Assad's regime was still in power. So today, Sophie, we'd like you to share your insights about how disinformation spreads and the challenges we face as fact checkers and what audiences should keep in mind when they consume news or content online.
It's
Go
great.
away.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to talk
Yeah,
to you about this important topic and give you maybe a little insight into my day-to-day work at Corrective.
please. So, Sophie, help us understand disinformation. What is it?
So I think oftentimes when we talk about mis and disinformation, you hear the term fake news. So actually, when you talk about or talk with fact checkers like myself or other people in the fact checking community, you might see that people try to avoid this term fake news because when we look at politicians like Donald Trump or even Bolsonaro in Brazil, they use this term fake news to basically discredit any reports that go against them or against their own agenda. So as a fact checker, we try to be a bit more nuanced and talk about mis and disinformation. So misinformation just basically being something that is false but spread with no ill intent, and then disinformation on the other hand, that is false information that is spread with ill intent. So the person behind it actively knowing that what they're spreading is wrong. And that's the kind of stuff we are looking at on a daily basis with my team. We meet every day at 10 o'clock in the morning and have a conference. And before that, we do a very sophisticated monitoring across social media networks to see what types of misleading information we encounter online, be it from private people, individuals, or also politicians. And then we have a discussion. We have different criteria if we want to publish a fact check about it. And then we go about our work and conduct research.
So how do as consumers like so how do as consumers or maybe let's start with as journalists, like if you're working in the field, how should we operate in the realm of fact checking? I mean, let's say you have a daily agenda, news is coming in. So what would be your first step to start fact checking? How would you go about it?
I think it's with any journalistic piece, you start researching. So first of all, obviously you have a hunch if something is, misleading or not. So having been in this field for a while, you know that there are certain actors prone to spreading more, misleading content than others. So this might be already giving you some insight whether this information is right or wrong. And then you conduct research, you talk to people, you talk to experts. When we are confronted with footage from war and crises, we start verifying this footage to understand if this actually took place. We use open source material like satellite imagery. We use Google Maps to try to verify and geolocate certain images. So different types of techniques and tools we use depending on the fact check that we do. So one of it being, if we look at more scientific pieces around COVID-19, for instance, we had to delve into very scientific studies to look at what they're actually saying, talk to experts in this kind of field. And sometimes, for instance, in the wake of the Ukraine war, lots of the fact checks we conducted were more technical in terms of, verifying and geolocating and looking at whether the footage that we're seeing is authentic or not.
So it must be a challenge, right? Because since not having people on the ground and just relying on information on the internet when we know that internet is rife with already fake news and lots of mis and disinformation. So just to, I happen to have come across a recent investigation by your publication regarding Russian interference in German election, and that I think was quite comprehensive. Could you tell us a bit about that? How were you and your team were able to actually get hold of that or expose it?
Yeah, so maybe as a bit of background for those of you not following German politicians as actively as we are, or maybe some
Yeah,
others.
you've got a new chancellor.
Yeah, exactly. So we recently had federal elections, early ones, and we just also got a new chancellor. So very, very hot news. But so these elections took place, and generally speaking, before, during, and after elections, disinformation spreads widely. We've seen that last year, for instance, with many elections taking place around the world. If we look from our perspective, from a European, perspective, we had, lots of different elections taking place. We had the US election, for instance, across the world, but those were kind of the ones that we were looking at specifically. So we kind of have a good understanding of the type of information or disinformation that we might encounter. One is around alleged election fraud, for instance, that people who go and cast their ballot might not be able to, that there's something wrong with the ballot box. And then, on the second hand, we have certain disinformation campaigns that we have followed for a while. One of them is, or some of them are, Russian disinformation campaigns that we know and understand and that we keep track of. And so it wasn't a surprise for us to see that they also might have an interest in the federal elections in Germany and try to influence them. So this particular campaign that we looked at had already been active in the US election, for instance. And they set up a range of fake websites there to try to discredit some of the candidates. And for that, they made up local news websites. So instead of faking existing ones, that's a different campaign that we also observed. They set up different local websites that actually didn't exist. So one example was from a local news website, supposedly from San Francisco. So they just made that up. And on that website, they planted fake stories. And some of those fake stories were also fed by or generated by AI. So we knew of these tactics, and that was something that we could follow ahead of the elections. And so what we could see is that they also set up these fake news websites in Germany, like 100 fake news website, and they planted fake stories about some of the running candidates. For instance, they fabricated medical records of one of the candidates, actually of our chancellor. They also made up an affair, between, a guy and one of the female running candidates. They also created a fake story about a sexual abuse story. And for that, they also used AI generated footage. So this is the kind of stuff we were seeing and also reporting about.
So it's quite a tricky landscape to work in, if I may put it, and if I've understood correctly. So as consumers, as viewers, it's one should be able to tell or to relate to patterns that have been or had been or had happened across the world too, so that uh, they can catch the similarities, right? Must
Yeah,
be difficult. Yeah, please go ahead.
yeah. I just want to point out one thing. So the reason why we're able to keep track of these campaigns is also because I would say the fact checking community is pretty tight knit. And I think that's something, I mean, you work in journalism as well. You understand that sometimes it's about, who has the scoop and who's the first to report. And obviously,
Yeah.
that's also something that, exists in our editorial team. But because disinformation doesn't stop at borders and has this sort of transformative dynamic, and usually if something pops up here in Germany, it is, related to international news, chances are it's also gonna, emerge in Pakistan at some point. So it's super important that we stay in close contact with other fact-checking colleagues. And that helps us a lot when reporting about different patterns and disinformation campaigns and narratives across the world. So I think that's something that we can really rely on, this tight knit community that also helps us exchange, thoughts and knowledge. So that's, I would say, something very unique and helpful in my field of work.
Yeah, I so agree with it, and I can personally relate to it since I also work on fast news, on daily news output. And whenever I come across anything that I need to confirm, or I have a hunch that this may not be true, or this may be a part of a mis or disinformation campaign, I know a few platforms I can just go there and check or cross check. If you I don't know if you're following or not, India and Pakistan right now are on verge of a war, and there's lots of fake news there coming out. So this is one question that I had in mind when you were talking about fake websites. So on one hand, we have like these fake websites that are created for the very purpose of spreading fake news or to further, let's say, political agendas. We don't know for sure, but maybe it could be part of that. But then we also have these mainstream or legacy media outlets, let's say, not legacy in the sense of international media, but like mainstream media houses, giants like the big ones. But when they start spreading fake news uh, for nationalistic purposes or for furthering of their own political interests, so how do fact checkers identify such sophisticated campaigns? How would you do if you were there?
I think again it goes back to, I would say, so in our work, we rely on primary sources. So for me, a media report is not a primary source unless they are the only ones who talk to that one witness that we can't get a hold on, right? But if I, try to research something, I'm not going to rely on that media report to do my reporting, but I'm going to try to dig deep and talk to a, I don't know, witness and look at original footage, right? So media reports per se are not the foundation of any fact check that we do unless they are the primary source, right? So I think just as an origin of our fact checking work, that's not going to be something that we're going to build our entire fact check on. I would say it's very important to look at different media landscapes in different countries. So I would say, I guess, you are much more familiar with the media landscape in Pakistan, also familiar with the media landscape in Germany. And I would say that you agree that, there are some differences in terms of how some media
A lot of
outlets.
a lot of differences.
Yes, so there are differences in the way different media outlets report on it. Also in the UK, for instance, you have those red tops, boulevard papers, a lot of clickbaity work. We also have that in Germany, but I would say to a lesser extent. Um, I would say to a degree, you have a good grasp of the reputation of a media outlet. So that is from a journalistic perspective. Now,
Yeah.
from a reader's perspective, it's much more difficult sometimes if this big outlet, puts out a claim and you obviously tend to believe it and turns out to be wrong. In Germany, we have obviously different rules that media outlets have to follow in terms of transparency, in terms of ethics, in a way of their reporting. But sometimes it can be tricky, and I just want to add another aspect to it. It's not only that sometimes media reports convey wrong information, because they got their reporting wrong. I hope that doesn't happen on purpose, but if it does, they should correct it. But the second layer of it is that sometimes they also try to research and publish facts about disinformation. And through that, they amplify this false narrative, right? So sometimes it's also a question about what kind of disinformation do we actually want to report on? Because obviously, if it doesn't have relevance and significance, we run risk that through reporting about it, we actually make it bigger than it is.
Yeah, that's actually very true. And I so agree with your earlier point. You mentioned that it's so basic. Like going back to basic can help us understand or can help us fix this problem. Like if we can't reach the source, the primary source, then that means that there's something wrong with it, right? So we can't just take any claim on face value. So it's very important for viewers and readers as well. So, Sophie, you also talk about that there are different uh, frameworks and regulatory bodies, like let's say in Germany, different way of doing things. So would you say, or maybe we can talk about it, what do you think would be the importance of having strong regulatory standards, let's say? But some would argue, before you answer, I may add, I would like to add that some would argue that having strong regulatory, like regulations, may hamper the idea of free speech. So Do you think that it's a tricky space to navigate?
It's a common debate we have in Germany and I would say across the world. I mean, we might talk about it later on, but now with the recent decision by Meta to cut down their fact checking cooperation with US fact checking organizations, Zuckerberg, one argument he put forward was that fact checking is censorship, and that basically touches upon the point that it might infringe on freedom of speech. And I mean, I totally disagree with that statement because what fact checking does is the opposite. You know, it provides context and tries to inform readers so that they can come to their own conclusion based on facts. You know, it's not us imposing our own opinion, but we're just, you know, showing them those are the facts, you know, and then based upon our research, you know, or context, you can come to your own conclusion, you know. But but that's an argument that obviously is very prevalent in some circles, and specifically so among people who try to or who tend to seek spread disinformation themselves, I might add. um,
True.
yeah, I think from a European perspective, I think it's quite unique because we have different regulations like the Digital Services Act, you know, that has come into force that obliges tech platforms, you know, to do risk mitigation, for instance, and look at risk assessments in terms of illegal content. Now, it's important to understand that disinformation, I'm speaking about Germany here, per se is not illegal or forbidden, right? So if disinformation can be, you know, illegal in certain aspects, for instance, if you are spreading a fake statement or attributing a fake statement about a certain person or politician, you know, and that isn't the case. But per se, it's not illegal or forbidden, right? But there are these regulatory frameworks now through the Digital Services Act, for instance, that, you know, put a bit more pressure on tech platforms. Now, so far, we've seen that the response isn't too rigid, and we have different efforts among European fact-checking organizations where we look closely at the reports provided by the tech platforms on a European level, for instance, and look at whether they actually comply with the obligations put forward in the DSA. You know, that's one of the
So,
things that we look at. Yeah,
so,
but
so
I
do
just
they
got to
do they
say
do
that.
that? Yeah,
Mhm. I
yeah, yeah.
just want
Please
to
go ahead.
say, yeah, I just want to add that I think or our understanding at Corrective is always that you know, the approach to combat mis and disinformation needs to be multifaceted. Obviously, regulation is one aspect, but the other aspect is also um, enhancing media and information literacy among citizens, right? Do debunking, but also do pre-bunking. And we might talk about this later on, but have like a multifaceted approach that includes citizens, that is not only top down, but also bottom up.
Yeah. So let's talk about pre-bunking. I'm very interested in this term. I think we don't talk about it much often. The focus is mostly on debunking. What is pre-bunking? What-
Yeah, it's good that you ask. I think it's some of the, like it's a term that has been like spread around a lot, and some people feel like, oh,
it
pre-banking.
ought to it sounds like a like you pre-bunk it so that you don't have to debunk it.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, that's basically the idea, I would say. So debunking, obviously, you know, the idea that once misleading or false information is out there, you do a fact check by debunking the claim, and like, you know, showing step by step why this information is wrong. And then pre-bunking, kind of, you know, going a step before that and looking at kind of the techniques and narratives that might spread and inoculate people. So kind of make them aware of these manipulative tactics, for instance, so that they can spot those false information ahead of time, right? So this is kind of the idea of pre-banking, making people aware of, you know, what like false information might look like and the things that they can, you know, pay attention to. And I think both needs to work together. So some people are like super keen on pre-bunking, which I understand. It's like this novel thing that we try and see as the one key to combating disinformation forever. But I do think that it needs to go together, right? Pre-bunking initiatives with debunks. And we've seen that during the elections just now in Germany. some of these claims went viral, and it was really important to debunk them, right? Be it from candidates themselves or be it about them, that they were just misleading. So I think,
If so I'm just cutting you off. I think I must add this, or coming from the world's richest man.
yeah.
So, how do you think that how do you view role of Elon Musk, who also owns this this huge platform, which is becoming like a hotbed of mis and disinformation and all sort of far right stuff, if I may give put it as a blanket statement. How dangerous do you think it is? Because I think there's no country that has been spared from his uh, from that platform. Let's say from this renewed platform, which just uh, keep on pushing this far right and hateful content. Like my Twitter timeline is just so full of hate, and I don't think how the algorithm got the idea that I deserve to see all those things.
Yeah, it's very alarming, because I think if you as a journalist think about X, formerly Twitter, it used to be the platform that you would go to, first thing in the morning to kind of scroll through your timeline and get your information. And I think to some extent it still is, it provides scoops. And if you have like a nice network of people that you follow, that's where you get your information. But over time, through Musk's takeover, we can see that the discourse online has, pretty much deteriorated. So a lot of people left the platform, and I feel like sought to go to some alternatives that, to my understanding, like Blue Sky or whatever, they obviously aren't as big as Twitter, or X. But it's not the platform that it used to be, and we definitely see that there's more mis and disinformation happening, and it is very alarming.
It's alarming to the extent that they claim about combating disinformation by providing these readers' notes and feedback and everything. But those readers' notes, I would like to know pick your brains on it. What do you think about this readers' context when they add, readers' feedback? I think they add on to the fake news. They're adding on to the misinformation, disinformation. And those notes are being treated as like debunking the original statement when they're doing anything but.
Yeah, it's interesting because Meta themselves, they are also rolling out community notes or something very similar on their platforms. And obviously they are mirroring it on the efforts seen on X/Twitter, right? And
Yeah.
if you look at how they work, community notes as a tool themselves, so people from a wide range of political spectrum need to agree that something is, for instance, missing context. And once that's the case, the link, the context will appear on site, right? So just from a on a basis, community notes rarely happen because a lot of people need to agree on them firsthand, right? So that means a lot of stuff continues to be spread without context labeled. And then to a certain degree, also, what kind of context or what kind of claims are being rated at all. So from our perspective, definitely it's not sufficient. What I like about the idea of community notes is that it is a community-driven approach, and that's also something that we try to amplify at Correctiv, right? So enhance people's ability that they themselves can understand if something is misleading or fake. But to a certain extent, it needs to follow certain journalistic criteria and standards, and it doesn't, in the way it's being handled right now. So it's not sufficient at all, and it's not, cohesive at all. So lots of potential to improve, to put it mildly.
Definitely. So you think there could be a need to fact check community notes as well at some point?
I think there have been studies and reports around community notes and the extent of whether this is true. And there have been instances where community notes have been shown to be wrong, for sure. So those kind of findings exist already. We haven't done any assessment of community notes so far, but it's something I'm very interested to look into more deeply, specifically now that Meta is trying to launch or has launched something very similar in the US.
That's very interesting. We'll see how it unfolds.
One interesting aspect I wanted to add to this is that a Spanish fact-checking outlet, Maldita, they did an assessment around community notes, and actually it's interesting because they looked at the kind of links or the kind of sources that people most often refer to in community notes, and turns out that people, I think, the third most quoted source was fact checks, which I thought was interesting because the whole point was that people said, like Musk, like Zuckerberg, we need to get rid of fact checkers because supposedly, they're limiting our, free speech or whatever. But turns out people refer to fact checks as credible source, right?
So,
So I thought that was a very interesting
so,
finding.
it's a moment of vindication. That's great. So, Sophie, let's talk about the future of fact checking. So, how like we're living in an age of AI, deep fakes, AI generated content, which is sometimes, I mean, sometimes it's easier to identify, and sometimes it gets very tricky. And especially if it's embedded as part of a disinformation or misinformation campaign to serve a purpose. So how a common user, let's say, what are the steps or points to keep in mind to identify deepfake? Are there any tools, or it would just be a hunch?
I would say there are different steps to follow, and depending on the type of AI footage, I would say maybe there's also some differences. So obviously, we have fake videos, we have fake photos, and we have fake audio. I would say fake audio is the hardest to spot at the moment, specifically if you are not trained or don't know kind of what to look at. If you look at a fake video or like a fake photo, the first thing obviously is that you can pay close attention to some of the details that you see in the footage themselves,
Hands.
right? The
AI
hands,
doesn't get the
right?
hands right.
The infamous picture of the dad in Gaza, right, with the five children. I'm not
Yeah,
sure if you remember. And then I think he was missing hands or had two or three
yeah.
hands. So like look at details and try to spot any irregularities. If you have a video, also pay close attention to just the scene itself. Does it make sense? For instance, if there's like a huge collapse of a bridge and people are just walking casually through the streets, I think that defies common sense. And a part of that, you can also just do a quick Google search or use any search engine of your choice to see are there any credible reports about that specific events. You can also look specifically for fact checks themselves. You can use Google or like reverse image search to see maybe that footage or that photo has already been debunked or is lacking context because it has been published already some years ago in a very different setting or context itself. So those are kind of like the single steps. Of course, there are certain tools also that can tell you the likelihood whether something is AI generated or not. We are always being very cautious with these kind of tools because yes, they can give you an indication if something is indeed AI generated, but sometimes they're wrong. So we always, talk to experts, use maybe those tools, and also follow these steps that I just explained ourselves to assess whether something is AI generated or not.
Yeah, the key takeaway is common sense. I think that's very important.
I think that's sometimes also something we underrate, like the critical thinking. And it's also, I think, something that we have to teach and also stay vigilant about. Just to use common sense. Okay, that makes me feel very weird. Could that actually be? Disinformation works so well because it steers negative sentiments. If it's anger, if it's hatred, if it's something that feels uneasy. So if you feel that something is kind of steering you up, when you see or perceive something, think twice about it before spreading it or forwarding it to a friend.
Yeah, or maybe golden rule: wait for a couple of hours. Maybe you'll calm down.
For sure, for sure. I mean, always if you're not sure, yeah.
Yes, but one should never do outrage posting. It's embarrassing.
I think that goes for anything, right?
True that. So true. So true. Uh, so on a personal level, how are you as an editor in chief of a major fact checking publication house adapting to these new emerging challenges?
Mm, I feel like every day is a challenge in the fact checking world. So I think I can say that there's not much that can shock me in terms of the type of information that we perceive, and because we've been doing this for a while, I feel like we have a good grasp of the challenges and tools and techniques, also because we're in touch with other fact checking colleagues. I mean, I give an example. Last year, we had the European elections, and everyone was so alarmed about the potential influence of AI. And turns out it wasn't that bad. I'm not saying that it's not going to be bad, because there were some instances with, fake robot calls, or there was like a fake audio that went super viral. But overall, it was manageable, because I think we were approaching it with time and resources. But it can be very stressful to work in this line of field. So I feel like, and it can be very rewarding. I would say in no other field of work have I received so much um, enthusiasm, and sometimes readers that reach out to us that are like, thanks so much. Like, I have these difficult conversations at home with my family because they think climate change is a hoax. And sometimes I'm running out of arguments, and I could send them your fact check, and then ta 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 ta. So it goes both ways. It's very tricky and stressful, but it can also be very rewarding.
Climate change is a hoax. Is the most that it keeps on coming back every couple of months. But flat earthers are back. Would you believe it?
I feel like, I mean, you just gotta find that Telegram group, and I'm sure you'll find it.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So we just to wrap up our episode, we talk about that AI or art deep fakes. They're creating more problems. But could there be benefits of this technology? I mean, how can we use it to our benefit? Maybe to identify maybe more links. Can we? Is it possible?
Absolutely, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because there's always challenges, but there's also so many prospects with using AI. We already try to integrate it into our daily work. For instance, we have a WhatsApp tip line, so people can reach out to us. I know WhatsApp is very popular in Pakistan,
Oh yeah,
but yeah, so you can
the
we
primary
have.
source of misinformation and disinformation.
I know, but also I think that's why it's so important to be present on WhatsApp, and also provide a channel for people to reach out to you, because maybe they encounter some information and they can send it to you. So we have a WhatsApp chatbot, for instance, where people can reach out to us and send us potential false information, and then this is connected to a backend, for instance. And if we've published stuff about it, they automatically send it back to the reader or provide some context to them. This is kind of like one way we use already some, a system, integrating AI. If you look at tools that use AI to transcribe, videos that take, ages to watch, that helps us journalists on our daily basis.
Oh my goodness,
Obviously,
those have been a lifesaver.
right? I mean,
Tell
you
me
always have
about
to
it.
double check. You always have to double check
Yeah.
sometimes,
Oh, of course.
those
Yeah.
tricky parts, but it saves us so much time. And then obviously, in terms of, that's something we are working on. If you watch debates, in Parliament, for instance, those can be very, very time consuming as well. And working on a solution where they identify potential false statements themselves, and then you, as a human, as a journalist, look at them more closely, but you don't have to watch and follow the entire thing. So this is kind of also a way of helping us monitor and stay on track with different debates that are going on. Yeah, and overall, I feel like integrating it in our community-based approaches at Faktenforum. That's what we call it at Correctiv. So I do think we can definitely use it to help us in our daily work.
Yeah, this also reminds me of this one instance when during Trump's first term, I think one of the major U.S. Media houses they ran a live, lie detector or something.
Wow,
Trump
yeah.
was speaking, and there was I think that was a human was doing it, but maybe we can train a bot, an AI bot to do something like that. But glad that we discussed this topic. So, Peter, so how would you like to wrap it up? Like in terms of how viewers should take into account, like viewers who are not journalists necessarily. What would you say are would be absolutely important to able to spot fake news or don't or not becoming a victim of mis or disinformation? If
Mhm.
if you would just like to wrap it up.
I would say there's two maybe key messages I would sort of leave you with. So one of them being, for users and readers and us journalists to stay critical. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't believe anything anymore, because obviously I think there are a lot of great journalists out there who do tremendous work, and they're very reputable. But just in terms of what we perceive and consume online, stay critical, follow these very basic steps. If it's a targeted Google search, if it's a reverse image search, if it's just like commenting and asking for a source, if someone sends you something outrageous that can't really believe. Those are kind of the simple steps that everyone should follow if something seems too crazy to be true, for instance, or too good to be true, or too bad to be true. And on a second level, in terms of understanding why it's so important to talk about this topic, I think, and that's something we try to do, is we want to include citizens in our journalistic world. And I think more outlets should do the same, because through them we not only understand the types of misleading content that is circulating out there, for instance on WhatsApp, but we can also work together, train them, and make them citizen fact checkers themselves. And I guess our ideal world would be that it doesn't need fact checkers like me anymore, which would be sad because I like my job. But in an ideal world, everyone should be able to spot mis and disinformation by themselves, so that the people spreading it don't have any impact anymore.
I mean, that's a great conclusion. Thank you so much for your time, Sophie, and for this very important discussion with us. We'll be back with the next episode. Thank you, everybody, for watching.